And today we have a very special session. It's brought to the group in partnership and in collaboration with Southerly, which is an independent nonprofit media organization that serves communities in the South who face environmental justice and are most and are most at risk of the effects of climate change. We encourage you to subscribe to their newsletter and consider making a donation. And we'll put all of these links in the chat as we get started. So feel free to check them out at your leisure. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our two guests today and kick off our session, Climate in Conversation. Lyndsey Gilpin is the founder and executive editor of Southerly. She's based in Louisville, and she has covered climate change, energy, and environmental justice for many years. Amal Ahmed is a disaster preparedness and recovery reporter with Southerly, and she's based in Dallas. And her focus is on climate and the environment, and in particular, justice and equity in this space. So what I'm going to do is turn things over to Lindsey for a few minutes to give an intro, and then we'll hear from Amal, and after that, we'll have a conversation all together. Thanks so much.
Hey, everyone. Oh, there's my face. Okay, I can see my, I can see myself.
Yeah.
Hi, it's so nice to see you all and to be here. I'm really excited to hear about everyone's backgrounds in the chat. This is just super awesome. It's a kind of a group like adaptation professionals and related industries is just a group that we want to reach more of, and we don't always get the opportunity. So thank you to Justine and CALE for providing us with this space to talk to you all. Yeah, so I'm Lindsey. I'm here in Louisville, Kentucky. I founded Southerly I started as a newsletter in early 2017, late 2016, after I was out west for a couple of years reporting on environmental issues and climate change in particular. Moved back home to the South, to my hometown of Louisville, and have since moved around quite a bit in this region, but have grown Southerly from a newsletter, just really looking at environmental justice across the region, to a media organization that not only reports about, climate change, energy, infrastructure, disasters, like all of these things, agriculture, food, that fall into this category of environmental issues, but really works to be in service to the communities that we cover, that we're writing about. So making sure that that journalism meets them where they're at, provides them information that they may not have had access to via like normal channels, especially if they're in a place where newspapers have closed in rural areas in particular, or they're not, Black and brown communities not being reached by the news outlets that should be serving them, right? So trying really hard to reach people both online and offline. So we do a lot of printed resources, brochures, fact sheets, pamphlets around the issues we cover, and we do a lot of events and workshops, and have really this year in 2022, I've been taking that a step further into like partnering with not just journalism outlets to do stories, but community organizations to distribute that information and make sure that people feel empowered and involved in the process of journalism, because it is a public service and it is here for all of you all and everyone. And yeah, I'm really excited. We cover a lot about disaster recovery, which is why Amal is here. That's just been something that we've seen over and over again that people want more information on, that obviously there's always something happening, unfortunately. You can kind of bank on it at this point, like whether it's a hurricane, tornado, wildfire, anything in the South. And so flooding in particular in inland communities that isn't often talked about. So we're doing a lot around disaster preparedness and recovery, which I'm sure aligns with what a lot of you all are working on. Infrastructure, so water quality in particular is a big one. And then public health and pollution from landfills, industrial sites, things like that, and how sort of climate impacts those things. So those are like the three main areas we're covering. But I am really excited to kind of dig into all of these things that I'm sort of overviewing right now. And and hear questions from you all. So feel free to I want it to be a conversation. So if you have a question and you just, want to put it in the chat, I can try to get to it. We'll obviously have a Q&A session, but I'm really excited to hear from you all. And Amal, do you want to just say hey real quick?
Yeah, sure. I'm Amal, so I work with Lindsey at Southerly, and I have been sort of heading up a lot of the community engagement stuff around disaster recovery that we're hoping to launch this year. So far that's included creating surveys so that folks like y'all can tell us how we can work better with you, and so we can get that feedback and incorporate that into our work. Creating a disaster glossary, which has a lot of terms and tips on planning and stuff like that that's scattered across all these sorts of different government agencies, and putting it in one place so that people can access it in one place, download it, take it offline, distribute it. So those are just some of the things that we're trying to do, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that in depth. Yeah, excited to be here and to talk more about what we're doing.
Thanks so much. So I think we'll turn to some of the questions that we have for you. Let me get Lindsey into the spotlight as well. And the first one is, you may not be surprised, is how do you approach communicating about climate change in your work? And also, how has that evolved for you over time?
Yeah, I can talk about it from I'll talk about it from a sort of broader perspective as someone running an organization, and then Amal can speak better to as a reporter consistently covering this, because unfortunately, I don't get to write very much anymore, running a nonprofit and all. So I think, the reason I started Southerly was because I was very frustrated with the way that the lack of environmental and climate change coverage in the South in particular, and the way it was often framed in communities that aren't big cities already trying to address climate change. So, typically every year there's a survey that comes out about how many people believe in climate change, right? And there's, half the country believes in it, half the country doesn't. And we need to kind of make sure that the people who don't feel dumb about not believing in climate change. And I have always just been very frustrated with that kind of rhetoric around climate change, because it doesn't really serve the people that we're trying to reach. So for instance, there are a lot of people that I kind of discovered through reporting and just communicating with folks around the region, not just professionals, but just residents who have been through extreme weather or disasters, that, often want to talk about how how extreme weather or disasters have affected their lives, but don't have the language or understand the language, or feel alienated from the climate conversation. So they don't want to talk about it in those terms, right? So they'll talk about how, their crop yields have changed, like farmers talking about that, or folks will talk about how they want to get programs to buy out their land or to help them better prepare for flooding, and over again, and just kind of come up to the fact that so many people in this country may not go to a climate march or feel like they're activists, but really understand how their environment is changing and how their community is changing, and that they want to do something about it or understand it better, but don't necessarily know what to do, because as you all know, it's just a very overwhelming topic and it's scary and frustrating, and it's so politicized, and that's a lot of that is on the media for making it that way for so long, giving microphones to climate deniers and saying that it's, like a both sides kind of argument. And now we're finally at the point where that isn't happening as much, or if at all. It's that's changed a lot in the last, just 10 years, but it's still a lot of kind of snarky, if you don't get this, then you're just if you're not calling it a crisis, you're not getting it. So we try really hard to kind of meet people where they're at, describe it in their terms, we're solid about the science, we explain that pretty much in every story, and climate is really in every story that we do, whether it's about the coal industry or about extreme weather or about infrastructure or how like communication systems are changing because of climate change. And I think that just continuing to make sure that we show how it's interconnected with all of these other topics, you know, business, health, especially health, because that's often what most people want to talk about, and what they care most about, right? And they can see firsthand. And then also treating people as experts of their own lives. Like they know, they've lived in a place for generations. They know what's going on. They know, they might not know how to talk about it or want to talk about it in the same way that like you or I do, but just kind of realizing that and tackling it from that perspective, I think has helped a lot, in not just like my own understanding of covering this, but also in making sure that people feel comfortable in talking about these things and don't feel intimidated by it. But Amal, what do you think, just as like how your reporting has changed?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the most helpful thing that I've done, I mean, I know you talked about this a little bit, is, you know, I think there's a way that like climate change gets talked about politically and whatever, and like setting that aside, I think has been just really helpful for me in my reporting, right? Because at the end of the day, like what I want to talk about and what I'm focused on is like, how are communities on the ground being affected, and are their local leaders doing what they need to be doing to keep people safe, right? Because I think so much of this actually comes down to like, you know, do people at the local government level like know how to prepare? Are they giving folks the resources they need? Is the communication there, right? So in an extreme event like a hurricane, right? Like, how are these kind of smaller levels of government being empowered to actually address the problem at hand, right? So, and I think also, you know, in Texas, I think a lot of my reporting has actually done the opposite of what I think a lot of people might expect, right? Is that in all of these frontline communities, you have people who are very much fighting to be able to live where they live, right? Because they know that in a couple of years, this is going to be more and more dangerous, right? So I actually have not encountered a lot of like climate denialism in my work, right? Like I think a lot of people, like you said, like, you know, when the floods get worse, the hurricanes get worse, right? Like people know this and it's a danger to them, right? They've lived through it, and they're asking various levels of government to do more, right? So I think that's definitely been a shift. And I think that, you know, can only really come from being like rooted in a place and understanding some of these more complicated things and sort of, yeah, setting aside like this kind of, I guess, politicized aspect of it. And also recognizing that a lot of like mainstream environmental groups have also kind of written off a lot of the communities that I think Southerly focuses on, right? Whether that's rural communities, right, where climate change gets talked about in a way that like, I don't know, Greenpeace might not want to talk about it, right? Like I think thinking about those kind of dynamics is really important in how we approach our work. But also thinking about environmental justice communities that have been asking for attention for a very long time and asking for resources, right? And a lot of that has just not been delivered. So I think focusing on those sort of intersections has been, I think, kind of the biggest shift in my own work, and has like really shown me how much, you know, as much as it is a problem that, okay, yes, like we should all be on the same page about climate science, like there are other ways to talk about this issue that I think are far more productive and can actually get people the results that they need.
Yeah, and I think too, focusing on sort of the bigger systems and how they work and giving people context to how they work is really helpful. You know, like all of, you know, we all at this point, you know, we kind of understand like the fossil fuel industry and its role, right? But like, what are the other systems and institutions that uphold that industry? How is climate policy at the federal level? How does that actually affect, you know, people in rural Eastern Kentucky? Because like when you're there, and I've lived in rural Eastern Kentucky, like you really don't feel like anything that's happening at the federal level around climate policy is going to actually affect you. But when a flood comes, like it does. And, you know, when you need new infrastructure, it does. And when there's new coal mining, like strip mining that is causing or leading to a lot of those floods, then it does. So trying to really figure out like, what are all of the systems that work together, and same with like what systems work to, I think just like reiterating over and over again, like the systems that oppress people, Black people, brown people, immigrants, low income folks, communities of color in general, like that just like we work really hard to continue to like amplify the voices in those communities. And I think that is sort of like a reckoning happening, not just in journalism, right, but in every place, every corner of this country, or should be. And so making sure that the people we're talking to and the people like giving input and understanding like how FEMA works, how climate policy works, how renewable energy works, like making sure they are the ones that have input in those projects and understand their role in this whole, like whatever is going to happen with climate adaptation and mitigation too. I think that's really important.
Thanks so much. I think you've already covered a bit who you're trying to reach, but I would love to hear more about what have been some of the successes and challenges of trying to reach these groups, and maybe you can tell us specifically some stories about how you've done it, you've managed to connect with a group, or you've struggled in the past.
Yeah, so just with Southerly as an organization, I think, like I said, just started as a newsletter. We were kind of reaching younger, progressive people via the newsletter, people who are sort of already kind of like in tune with what is going on. Also still reaching some newer folks, some people that just like stumbled upon it, older people, that sort of thing. But we didn't want to preach to the choir. So we're like, okay, how do we, because I think that's just a huge issue in environmental reporting in general, or has, especially in the last few years, as like outlets specifically geared towards environmental issues or climate change in general, that's, there's just sort of preaching to the choir. And so it's like, how do we get past that? And the reality that I have found is that, you can write an investigation every month for a year, and that does not guarantee that anyone is going to see it. Like anyone that needs to see it is going to see it. And that doesn't mean it's not worth doing, right? Like the investigations coming out of ProPublica and New York Times, like all of these big outlets that are like unearthing really important issues and disparities are super important. But most people that we're trying to reach, like I was saying, low wealth folks, rural communities in particular without consistent internet access, or places where there are no newspaper, like literally no newspaper, or maybe one weekly newspaper that's reprinting like press releases from different industries and companies, or the only like environmental stories they get are like op-eds from activists, right? So those types of places, and the places where environmental injustice is happening most, fence line communities, that kind of reaching them is, there's no point in doing this work unless you're reaching them, So we found that a lot of times like that they don't have time. They're working, they're trying to understand everything. They don't have time to like dissect climate policy. And so what we've done is really worked on like our partnerships with community organizations, with local news outlets, of course, like public radio stations, newspapers, things like that, but also community organizations to actually distribute like print resources to people. So one quick example I'll just give is we've been working in Eastern North Carolina. Well, let me give this example. So in Southwest Louisiana, we reported on Hurricane Laura that hit in 2020, and Hurricane Delta that hit like 6 weeks after that. And we had this whole like long series that we did. One of our reporters, Carly Berlin, was our Gulf Coast correspondent for a couple of years. And she did this wonderful series on sort of like homelessness that had like, because of housing crisis that had gone up since the hurricane, on some health issues, how teachers were dealing. It was all during the pandemic, so it had to do with that. And over again, we sort of found out that people were struggling with mental health around like climate anxiety, around the hurricane, all of this. So we worked with the United Way in that area and a local like mental health clinic, and sort of like vetted some resources, the low cost or free ones, and made like a guidebook that we distributed through those places to get people into these clinics and get some resources that they needed. And then, we've done other other outreach things around, you know, in North Carolina, we're talking a lot about hog farming, and there's Eastern North Carolina has a lot of flooding. And so there, and of course, there's a lot of discussion around like renewable energy is like creating energy from these waste sources from hog farms. Does that work? There's just a lot of confusion around like the energy aspect, the climate adaptation aspect, like everything. So we've been like working with a local environmental justice organization to break that down in like a series of like pamphlets and guides and events. And that we're finding is like, it's harder to track the impact of that, right? Because you have to sort of keep up with people and be like, all right, we have a lasting relationship that we can like keep coming back to and saying like, okay, how many more people like came to your meeting, or how many more people picked up that pamphlet? And like, that's a lot slower and more, I think, energy intensive on both sides. I mean, it's community organizing, right? Like that's what it ends up being, and making sure that information is accurate is like the most important part of that. And so we found like a lot of success in that, but it's still really hard work, and it's really hard to track the impact from that and to figure out like, you know, it's different in every single place, wherever they are, whether they're on the coast or inland. Like it just looks different because every community is different. But our goal is to sort of like create templates for those. Like, so many places are dealing with flooding, so many places are dealing with hurricanes. How can we figure out like to take a template of like a flyer or a story or a workshop from community to community? And that's sort of the broader goal of like this information access thing. But I'll stop there and let Amal talk about if you have any examples of like reaching people.
Yeah, I guess, so I'm a little bit newer to like the engagement journalism model, and, you know, working with Southerly is sort of a new venture for me. And I think that's sort of the most exciting part, right, that Lindsey just described. But I can talk a little bit about like my previous work, you know, reporting in Texas. And I think, you know, I think impact when you're writing about environmental justice communities, sort of the way that I think of it is like, I know I've done a good job when I know that the folks that I'm writing about really appreciate that their narrative has finally made it into sort of a record, right? A lot of times that's sort of the bar that I'm trying to meet, right? Because I'm not really explaining to people like what they already know in a lot of cases, right? But it's like this idea that like communities that have just not been heard or listened to for so long, finally getting a chance to like set the record straight and like put their version of things out, and like have, you know, as a reporter, like I'm the one that can sort of broker like, okay, I'm going to get this company to respond to this, or this government agency that didn't do this, right? And to sort of have this like narrative laid out, I think, you know, to see that that's really powerful for people is also something that I think, you know, is sort of a part of journalism that I think is really rewarding in its own way, right? It's obviously a little bit different in impact. Like I think there are more direct things that we can be doing, and that's really important. Yeah, I think, you know, it's also, I think, in a place like Texas, like I don't kind of go into a story expecting really anyone in state government to like read my stories and change policies. I always hope they will, but you know, so far that has not happened. I think it's a very high bar to meet, right? So yeah, I mean, I kind of like Lindsey was saying, those investigations are really important, and like those 10,000 word pieces are really important, but like they're not always for the folks that live there, right? Like the people who kind of know what they've already been experiencing or whatever. Like it's really to raise awareness in other kind of aspects of the communities that we live in. So kind of balancing those needs has always been a really interesting line to walk, I think. Yeah, I don't know if I answered that question, but just some thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And I know, Justine, you put this in the chat, but if like any of you all listening, watching have run into information access challenges in your work, like whether it's with like city planning, with like adaptation measures, with FEMA, and I saw there were a couple of people from FEMA in here, like I would just love to hear that perspective, because that not only like, I mean, solidarity and like trying to figure out how to get information to people, but it also helps us as journalists figure out like to do any of this work, right? Like we have to work together, you know, I mean, we're going to hold power to account always, but and make sure that people get the truth, but and we have to figure out like a communication system that isn't breaking down at like every place that it could break down, because that's currently where we're at, right? Like there's either nothing that's formalized, or there's just people are struggling to understand like what any of this means for them and get frustrated with it. And I think that it's kind of like taking a step back and being like, okay, how can we all like figure this out?
Yeah, that's so great. I would love to hear from some of our participants today, how they're thinking about this. But I just want to pick up on something that Amal mentioned, in terms of understanding the link between what you're writing about or what you're covering and the community that it focuses on. But I'm also curious if you see that there are connections that start in one place and then extend to another community, or a story that leads you from one, beginning to a different end. If that's something that's come up in your work as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, oil and gas is a great example in Texas, right? So some of my reporting, I did a story that I started focusing on one town that was dealing with, there was like this permitting public hearing that was coming up about an oil export facility, right? So I was like, okay, I'm going to go attend this webinar. Like, I know the folks kind of involved in this. And then I think during that webinar, right, they put up a map and it's like, here are all the other towns in Texas where this is happening. It's just like all up and down the coast, right? So you start to realize like, okay, so it's not just one thing in isolation, right? It's like this entire region where this industry can kind of do whatever it wants, right? And we're dealing with the same government agencies and the same communities who are like fighting back with like limited resources, right? Oftentimes low-income communities, rural communities, people of color, right? A lot of non-English speaking communities, right? So you run into like the same issues over and over again. And I think those kinds of stories where you can show how this entire structure of government, right, is kind of broken and it's not really serving the people that it's supposed to serve, right? That kind of led me down that narrative, right? Of here you have the folks that are already most vulnerable to climate change, getting all these projects that's going to make flooding worse, hurricanes stronger, like air pollution worse, right? For people who already have like elevated rates of cancer, right? And this is just happening over and over and over again, right? Yeah, I think when you're writing about something like industry, like I think that's really common, right? Because that's not just in Texas either. It's like Louisiana, Mississippi, like kind of all across this Gulf South where we have that industry built out, right? You're running into the same problems, and it's the same federal government agencies that haven't really changed their way of thinking about how they permit these projects and the way that they solicit feedback, right? A lot of these are like not accessible, right? If you don't have internet now with the pandemic, right? Like how are you supposed to log on to go to a public hearing, right? Or a public comments meeting, or how are you supposed to access it in like Spanish or Vietnamese, right? Those things aren't really offered a lot of times. So yeah, does that answer your question, Justine?
Yeah. Okay. Lindsey, anything you want to add?
Yeah, no, I think that was a perfect example. One of the kind of strengths that Southerly has as a regional publication is the ability to kind of step back and connect the dots, like I was saying, between different places. I think not just in sort of disasters, but more generally in, when it comes to industry or development, communities are made to feel in isolation by industry, by politicians. The point is to make them feel isolated so they don't feel like they can fight back or get information that they need. I see some talk in the chat about misinformation. There's rampant misinformation about like what is good for a community, what is going to benefit it, what is short-term versus long-term, like what is actually going to help them survive or adapt. And I think that, the strength that we have is being able to show, like, when you can connect the dots a little bit, you can show people, organizers, regular people, that they are not in isolation, that they are dealing, it's something going on in Mississippi is also happening in Louisiana, or Texas and Louisiana, or even, across kind of different parts of the region. Like I talk a lot about Appalachia because my family is from there, but like, the flooding and the infrastructure issues in sort of like the trying to adapt to that in Eastern Kentucky, West Virginia is very similar. It's the same like agencies, it's the same type of decision-making processes that need to be done on the coast. And so one of the ways that we're trying to tackle that is sort of getting out like shared language for people. So I saw in here, Emily wrote about the kind of terminology, and like that's something that we have kept coming up against. And we came up with this idea for a glossary to start, at least online, and then hopefully turn it into something print or allow like community organizers to print it and distribute it. So that people know like what do, there's so much information like 3 days before something happens, right? But well in advance, we could tell people, all right, this is what happens with disasters. This is what the agencies are that that really kind of make the decisions about the situations. Here's how eventually we'd like to sort of add in sort of the like permitting process stuff, like how development ties into that, how public health ties into that. So trying to figure out like how to connect the dots between all these things. And then that way, hopefully we can start to get to like a shared kind of understanding of that. And that also, of course, requires a lot of like distribution of that, because you can't reach everyone with a glossary online. But our hope is that, we have a place where people can submit things that they're curious about, and kind of making it more of a two-way conversation to say like, we're all trying to figure this out. So let us help you like figure out what's truth and what is not, I think is really helpful in that regard too. Justine, you might have another question. Sorry, I was just reading the chat to see there was something I wanted to answer, but I can't remember.
There are a lot of great questions in the chat, but I think, maybe this pulls some of them together. I see a lot about, information access, combating misinformation, recognizing differences of viewpoints, while not necessarily validating all viewpoints, especially ones that are not based in science. And then I think in addition to that, the silos of information, like cutting across disciplines, across boundaries. And so much of what you're saying is very similar, about journalism could also be said about planning. And I say this coming to this conversation as a climate adaptation planner and a community-based planner as one of my hats. So I think, part of the question is about what do you see as the role for journalism in advancing climate and disaster preparedness, environmental justice? And then maybe a side question to that. I love that Amal said the engagement model of journalism, which I feel like is a term that you probably are very familiar with, and sounds like community engagement models of practice or participatory planning practice. But I wonder if you can tell us more about how the journalism that you are practicing differs from what you see coming before, and then also how it can be more engaged with other disciplines. What do you see as the opportunities for learning and cross-pollination? So it's a lot in a big question, but you can tackle any piece of it.
Actually, so I can talk a little bit about the kind of broader thing again, but I'd love to hear from Amal on sort of what that's like, because I feel like you still are writing for like traditional outlets and also doing more and more of the stuff, and so it's really interesting to kind of like hear your perspective on that. I think just in general, we can't be everywhere at once. Like, we are a very small nonprofit. There's a movement in journalism to make journalism more participatory, to say, historically, this has been exclusive. It has catered to white people. It has been run by white men, and we have to change that. And like slowly but surely, right? Like newsrooms are changing, but the same like major problems still remain with like media conglomerates laying people off, like jobs being pretty scarce, being centered in the coasts. There's all these things, like as things get better, it's kind of like one step forward, two steps back for the journalism industry. But there is this like burgeoning movement around making sure journalism is the public service that it was intended to be, that it was when you think about the Black press, that, like decades and decades ago, that was kind of stomped out by white press, right? Like it is meant to answer questions that people have. It is meant to, reporting is not a science. Like you can learn how to report. And so trying to figure out how do we train people to do that work? Like we're working on a project now to host training so that residents in Texas and Louisiana can go to go to meetings and follow budgets and like follow FEMA processes to understand like what's going on and document that and share that with their community. And that is based off a model that has been really successful in bigger cities like Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland, where people are documenting city meetings and training them and paying them. So creating jobs in the process. And I think applying that to climate change and disasters in particular is really important because, you know, we can't be everywhere at once. There are so many things happening when it comes to climate change that it's just like we have to better prepare and use the knowledge of our community members to understand what's happening and to explain it. You know, there are already trusted systems, organizations, people that are doing this work in communities like unpaid on the side, like filling gaps in the information system and trying to make that more accessible and useful, I think is just really critical. And in that way, you can fight misinformation. I mean, I don't know the answer to like figuring out how to get it all off Facebook or whatever. What I do know is that like we need Facebook to reach a lot of people that we're trying to reach. So like one of our strategies is trying to get more involved in like Facebook groups that pop up after disasters or around a particular project or something that's like polluting a community. Like you see a lot of organizing on there. And so how do we kind of like get in with those communities and try to not tell people what to do, but be like, what do you need? What are you missing? Where are the gaps? And how can we work with you to help fill it or train people to help fill it? And that way it doesn't feel so like we're in our ivory tower trying to tell people what they need. And also, I think our role in general, like often, you know, when I was going through school was like, journalism is, you know, you give people information and they figure out what to do with it. And it's like, well, not really. Like we have to like, we don't like have an agenda in a way, but this idea that like you just give people information and they can handle all of it is like we all need help kind of understanding what things mean, how they connect, what to do with it. And we're all dealing with misinformation all the time, some more than others. And so I think that's especially problematic in environmental spaces and climate spaces in particular, obviously. So undoing that is really hard. But yeah, Amal, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, I think with disaster reporting, I think for me, like that was sort of this beat, like shows you how extractive journalism can be in a lot of ways, right? So the expectation is that you come into a community, you report on like a flood and like the aftermath, whatever, and then you get to leave, right? And that's typically how it's happened, right? Like, especially when you're not from the community, like so when you have something like the New York Times covering like flooding in Houston or Port Arthur, right? Like, this is not a community that the reporter lives in. And to be honest, like it's a transaction that isn't always fair, right? So you have people on the ground giving up hours and hours and hours to talk with a reporter. And then what are they getting back? They're getting back a story that like probably wasn't really written for them, right? In a lot of ways. You know, you hear it over and over again. It's like that didn't really capture what the problem is, right? Like I think a really great example of this is there was a piece once that talked about this issue in Houston, right, where the city has historically built up flood infrastructure in wealthier communities because they've been using cost-benefit analysis, right? And so lower-income communities just have not had any of those investments made, right? And their city was supposed to like undo that and focus on low-income communities. It hasn't really happened, blah, blah, blah. But then, you know, so you have the folks in those communities like spending all this time kind of rehashing traumatic experiences, right? Flooding, repeated, you know, disasters, like historic segregation, like racism, like decades of not being listened to. And then the reporter in that story also talks like a woman in a wealthy suburb who's like, well, those people can just, you know, they can afford Netflix, why aren't they paying for an insurance premium, right? And so to have that, I think is like a really disrespectful kind of way of doing journalism. And I don't think that returns anything to the community, right? Like you're not writing that story for the people in the communities that haven't been served by the government, right? So I think questioning like who's that for, right? That story doesn't like stories like that. And you know, to be honest, even some of the work that I've done, right? Like to recognize some of the limitations of it, right? Like even for me, like trying to focus on and center communities of color, right? Like that doesn't make the material conditions on the ground better, right? So it's like I'm asking for a lot of time from them and a lot of, you know, effort. And like, what are we giving back in return, right? Like, again, a lot of times it's information that people kind of already know, right? So with the stuff that Southerly is doing, the idea is like, what can we actually give people that they can use, tools, right? Like information that's like actionable, but beyond that, like deepening these community ties and other things, right? Like building up some of that or supporting what's already on the ground, right? I think is really important to think about. And I think a lot of journalists kind of frown upon it, to be honest. Like, I think there's a lot of tension about like, oh yeah, is that the correct way to do journalism, right? But I mean, yeah, I just think with disaster reporting, like, it's just so clear kind of the different power dynamics in that, and like, who we're really serving and like who we're really writing for, versus like engagement journalism allows you to say, well, we're doing this for you and we're doing it with you, right? Like it's not that we're coming in and doing it and then leaving, right? So I think that's sort of the main difference, I think, to me, in the approach and also sort of the framing that we're trying to take.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to think about it. One thing that struck me sort of in the chat, Rachel had written about kind of talking about adaptation and disaster management, how it differs from disaster management, and like helping people get ahead of things. I think about that a lot because it feels like we're in journalism. I mean, it's so reactive, right? Like everything is so reactive and everyone's trying to get attention on whatever just happened, but really, doing that work. But if we set up, so that's like the idea of like the disaster glossary in our projects with creating, like getting information out when they're sending out hurricane kits, for instance, in Texas, we're like working on a project to do that. And doing that in preparation, not just for this hurricane season, but hopefully in the future. And then kind of thinking longer term, like with the participatory reporting, what meetings do people need to go to understand like land development so that they know how that will affect, their flooding or their safety or their health in the future. And like, again, I say this a lot, I'm sorry, but like connecting the dots between those things, because it's just not clear when you're, it's just to the lay person. I mean, it's still not clear to me, like how it's all connected. So, and I think building relationships with people like you all, whether it's city planners, whether it's emergency managers, that's a big kind of group we're trying, because, those are like the trusted sources of information in times of crisis, but also making sure people understand how all these processes work, and that something coming 6 months down the pike could also really impact them. And that's important. So there's some like examples of our reporting in here, but I'm always, if you all ever have like story ideas or anything, like our emails are on the on our website.
That's great. Yeah, please all check out some of these links when you have a chance. So we're almost out of time, and I want to ask you one more question, which is basically, where do we go from here? Like how do we build better connections, better relationships between journalists and other professionals who see themselves and their work as serving communities? And I want to tag on to that also an additional thought about beyond the written word, what other forms of media? You talked about pamphlets, you talked about participating in meetings, art, photography, here we are on a webinar, podcast, etc. How do you see yourselves crossing beyond the written word to other media with that as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the main like thread through all of this is just building more trust. Like journalists, reporters, like the industry at large has really messed it up, like just kind of ruined trust in a lot of places. That's why misinformation is so rampant. That's why it's so easy to kind of infiltrate that. And, it's not all on this industry, but a lot of it is, and trying to understand, that good, solid reporting and like information gathering and resource sharing is more than just telling a story. It's having conversations more frequently. It's being in the community that you're reporting on, right? Like first and foremost is really important. And then making sure that, that we're not like parachuting in from somewhere. And then just having consistent relationship building and conversations around what's important and what's missing and what is frustrating, and making sure that, just as, Justine was mentioning, like participatory planning, like the people that will be affected are involved in that process, and that we do have experts of like certain disciplines or researchers or whoever we're talking to also, but like people living in a place are experts of their own lives and treating them like that. And I think that can serve journalists, and that can serve other professionals that are doing climate adaptation, that are doing disaster planning, mitigation, whatever it may be. And so I think the trust thing is really key. And that's hard because that takes a lot of time, and it's sort of like you have to like go backwards and then try to figure out how to go forwards again, but it's possible. And I'm really excited for sort of these sorts of spaces where we can talk freely about how we've messed up and how we can do better, and why climate change is really difficult to cover and to discuss and to figure out how to work together on, because, in the end, like, it's the same goal, right? Is to protect people and to make, places healthier and safer and more livable. And if they're not, then figure out like what we need to do. And so I'm really hopeful about that aspect. Like, I think people are taking it more seriously, and I hope that just by having more candid conversations outside of like, I need a quote for a story, is a way forward. Also, just, more generally kind of making sure that we do this participatory work, that we're constantly seeking feedback on our stories, that we're following up when we, if there is something happens at like a meeting or a lawsuit or an event or whatever, like making sure we check back in 6 months after that. And I think that that can serve sort of everyone in a community to do that. And the last thing I'll say is just kind of making sure that we, the shared language and this shared goal of trying to be better at communicating. I think that everyone can work on that, and just having that in mind, and making sure that the people at the center of it are the people that would be most affected and historically excluded from these conversations. I think that like that's a really hopeful piece, if we can focus on that. But Amal, I'll let you add.
I don't think I have anything. I think you got it really well. So I don't think I have anything.
Great, thank you both. I think I'm going to pick up on one question in the chat just before we do, because I think there's some interest in the platforms that you use beyond social media. What are the channels that you use to get information out, and make sure that, we've talked about pamphlets, we've talked about meetings. If there's anything else you want to add there before we close.
Yeah, I think, one thing that we always try to do is, if we're before a story or before a project, host listening sessions where we're asking people what they need. We have a survey that's, I think, in here, just trying to get people to tell us like what's missing from their and what's in their diet around, this is specifically around disasters, but it could be for anything, right? And have listening sessions where people are off the record, they can talk about what they need, and then kind of figuring out all right, what would be most useful? Who are we trying to reach? And then what medium works for that. So oftentimes this pamphlet fact sheet thing has been really popular because nonprofits are often doing that anyway, and trying to get that out. Maybe they just need help with capacity. So that's come up a lot, like brochures, that sort of thing. Texting is a thing that we haven't done yet, but is a very popular or growing in popularity and a very effective way to get information out. You get the alerts on your phone for certain things. How can we have that? Most people are accessing our journalism, and most journalism in general on the phone, might not have a computer, might not have great internet access, but have cell service. So how do we reach them to have questions or whatever? And then the other thing is just sort of like more workshops and in-person things. Obviously, that's been really hard because of the pandemic, but trying to get people in a room to create something together, whether that's like a vision for what they want to do in their community, or like an actual, we're doing one in Louisiana around like how like recovery and what that looks like. And they're going to create like a fact sheet during that workshop. And so that way it's more participatory in that way too. I think that trying to figure out the other mediums. I mean, they're radio, community radio, so interested in that. Public radio, like, yes, important, but also reaches a certain audience. So how can we get like talk radio, community radio? That's really interesting to me to try to figure out what that looks like. We partner with a Spanish language outlet in North Carolina, and they have a podcast for farm workers, and obviously it's in Spanish. And because they know farm workers can listen while they're out in the fields, but they're not, necessarily have time to read. And so making sure that we've done a lot of bilingual reporting with them in general, and to make sure that things are like easily translatable and are serving the audience they're intended for. So I think it's always thinking about who it's for first, and then like what form it should take. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And it's amazing to think about, how the similarities between the way that you're approaching communication and journalism and the work that we're doing. I think we're all doing in different spheres and fields to reach communities, to grow resilience, to plan for climate change. So I'm just going to take a minute to wrap up. But thank you, Lindsey and Amal, for joining us today. I feel like this is the beginning of a larger conversation. I hope that we will keep in touch, and that folks who joined us will also reach out to you and share stories and ideas, and really think about how journalism can play a role in the work that they're doing, and how methods and tools and strategies that you're talking about are applicable.